Hey, hello everybody. So we're going to talk today in class about gymnosperms and a little bit about plant reproduction and the evolution of that part of plants biology, the reproduction of plants. So let's start with that. So when plants came out of the ocean and first colonized land, there were no animals on land. So it was going to be quite a while before animals would creep up on land. So the first plants, those primitive plants, most of them, sorry, not most of them, all of them, were spore bearing plants. And they didn't produce flowers, they didn't produce seeds as we know them. So that is really interesting. Now, a spore is not a seed. So we'll go into that later, but just to know that a spore is a intermediate step in the reproduction process of a plant. So if you're a spore-boring plant, a spore is not really a seed; it's something else. Um, and there's no flowering structures, and the reproduction is a little different. So when we talk about ferns later, like the alternation of generations, which is complicated, but it's basically what a spore is, which defines it as not being a seed. A seed is like an egg. Okay, so we didn't get these plants until later on. So the first plants, spore-bearing plants, spores, uh, and these plants usually need water for the reproduction, for to actually help reproduction, um, and they uh, have an intermediate process. So these first spore-bearing plants, the mosses, liverworts, the really cool ones are these. So there's bryophytes, which we call them the bryophytes. All those really cool things, selaginella, which is I don't know the common names. Oh, there we go. Resurrection ferns. They're not really ferns, but they're like a type of primitive plant that can dry out and get the water. I like those. Horsetails are really cool. Horsetail, which look like reeds, these tall, long things. You sometimes see them in wet areas. They have spores from little cones. And there's a lot of other little guys that are mixed in, but these are all spore-bearing plants. Again, no pollinators, no animal pollinators needed. Over time, these plants gain robustness. They started to develop wood, actually, very woody stems. They started to develop uh, vascular tissues that moved water and nutrients up and down the plant's body. So the plant started to advance. And then we get so past the ferns. So those again, the fern spore bearing plants, those spore bearing bodies kind of turned into cone like structures. And these cone like structures, and I'm not a plant evolutionary biologist, at no means, but at some point, those structures turned into cones and arise the gymnosperms. Gymno meaning naked and sperm meaning seed. So we have this newer group of plants that's has evolved from spores to seeds. And the advantage of the seeds is they can persist longer in the environment. They're a little bit more hardy. They don't need moist conditions to survive, to persist, basically to last a long time. And as like you know, seeds can last years and years in the environment. And also, a seed gives a plant the opportunity to germinate when it needs to. For example, in California, a lot of our plants are germinate after a fire. So they need the fire to come through and actually burn that seed and alter that seed in order for it to germinate. Maybe the chemical alteration, maybe it's just burning the seed coat. So in a way, that seed is not only protection, but it makes that plant more adaptable to various things: cold, heat, fire, wetness. It allows that plant seeds to persist in an environment and then wait until the opportune time, to germinate. And that's really interesting. So those first group of plants, they were the gymnosperms, the naked seed plants, the cone bearing plants. And the gymnosperms, remember, are coming in still with no pollinators. So this kind of evolved before pollination by animals was a thing, really. So most of these are wind and rain pollinated. But this group of plants is super diverse. You have cycads and ginkgos and pine trees and fir trees, welwitchias, ephedra or native ephedras, and they a lot of them don't look like a typical conifer because most people when they think of conifer, cone bearing plant, are thinking of like a pine tree, a cedar tree, a juniper, and yes, those are the more common ones we do see. But there's a lot of plants in that group, and they're very ancient lineage because remember they're here a long time ago, before and just as mammals are evolving on land with these plants. So they're kind of a little bit ahead of the animal game. Some of the gymnosperms, like ginkgo and the podocarpus, I made a video about the podocarpus and ginkgo. They have like a cone that's very fleshy and very fruit-like. It's yellow or orange. It's colorful, juicy, and it might even be flavorful. And it's like a pseudo fruit or a fake fruit. So it's like a gymnosperm now is evolving with animals to distribute the seeds away from the mom plant. So that's really cool to see these gymnosperms that have these berry-like, fruit-like cones, basically, that act as fruit in all intents and purposes, but they're not true fruits. So the gymnosperms, um, also in their lineage, they're very tough plants. So all over the world, you'll find gymnosperms. So even though it's a primitive group of plants, even spore-bearing plants, all these plants still exist. You will find spore-bearing plants, you will find corn-bearing plants in abundance in many places. So even these really primitive reproduction methods before the flowers still work. Remember, there's many ways to do things. So we still see spore-bearing plants and many gymnosperms. You've seen pine trees and junipers and all sorts of them. Go to the mountains in California here, and you will see lots of gymnosperms. So they're very successful. One of the things that makes them successful is their structure. They're very hardy plants. They have a lot of resins typically in their woods. They can be either softwood or hardwood. And those resins and their structure allow them to adapt to many harsh climates. Most of them are found in a temperate or cooler climate. Think of your typical conifers, cedars, firs, spruces, junipers. But there are plenty of tropical conifers. So conifers don't need to be cold tolerant plants. They can be plants from tropical areas. Likewise, I was in Belize and there were like pine tree forests in Belize and in the Caribbean in tropical locations. So one of the things that pines do is they're hardy and they have a lot of resinous, adaptable wood. Remember, think about the oldest single living trees, the bristlecone pines. Part of their success is the wood. It's so hard and flexible and durable and adaptable. The bark strips and how the bark can heal and the resins. Think of the giant sequoias with their bark that's kind of like a fireproofing. So these trees have a lot of ingenuity in their wood, I like to say, and which makes them very adaptable to all sorts of climates. The tallest tree in the world that we know of right now, the coastal redwood, is a conifer, a gymnosperm. The largest single tree, the giant sequoia, is a gymnosperm, and then the oldest single tree, the bristlecone pine, is a gymnosperm. And there's also things like welwitchias that are really interesting plants that are kind of crazy. They have this interesting biology, and they have this very hardy nature because they were basically the first plants to develop true wood and woody stems. Not tree-like habit, but woody stems. There were many other previous iterations of trees in paleohistory from different orders of plants, but the gymnosperms were our first woody plants with true wood and bark. The other thing that makes them really successful is most gymnosperms make a association or a friendship or a relationship, if you will, with soil fungi. It's very important in gymnosperms to have this. We call it a mycorrhizal relationship. Myco being fungi, rhizal being root. This mycorrhizal relationship where the fungi and the plants are trading different resources. The plants, remember, plants are the only source of carbohydrates, so they're supplying carbs and sugars to the fungi, and the fungi might be supplying things like other nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, micronutrients that the fungus is actually uh, bringing in from the surrounding soil. So the fungus is making an exchange, if you will, in the plant as well. And this happens in the plant roots. But this relationship makes the plants more successful because they have a fungus to help them out versus just doing it on their own. Also, gymnosperms not having to necessarily, now remember, some gymnosperms have that pseudo fruit, that fake fruit, a cone that looks like a fruit, maybe like a berry or something, looks like a berry, but it's not a real berry. Those have evolved with animal vectors to move those seeds around. But a lot of the cones, even those fleshy ones, don't necessarily, or don't very rarely, or almost not at all, need any animals to pollinate it. So even the more advanced advanced in quotations, gymnosperms that have a fruit-like cone that rely on an animal for distribution of the babies, they are still mostly wind pollinated. So the vast majority of gymnosperms don't rely on a animal vector for pollination. Okay, so they don't need like a bird, a bee to do the work. It's usually wind or water. And that's important because it reduces that's how gymnosperms survive for so long, because it reduces the reliability on animals. They've survived mass extinctions, several mass extinctions, and they still persist. And that's because they're able to reproduce without animals. Uh, but some of them still have evolved with animals for the distribution of the seeds. Even cone-bearing plants. Look at the pinyon pine, or your Italian stone pine. If you're a plant ID, your Pinus pineas, and if you're a native plant ID, you're a pinyon pine, Pinus quadrifolius, monophyllus, or several different pinions. But many pines have a really nice, nutritious nut in the cone that is hoarded by chipmunks and squirrels and birds, and those birds literally and the chipmunks literally bury them and forget where they're at and actually plant the next trees. So they all still rely on, a lot of them still rely on animal vectors for the moving of the seeds, but not necessary for the pollination. The next group of plants are angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. This is where plants start to evolve a close relationship with animals to uh, achieve the sexual reproduction. And we'll talk about those later week in classes. So it's another video. But so the gymnosperm is really important. For our Plant ID students, remember gymnosperms, there's a lot of really, even though we're in the high desert, you can grow a lot of gymnosperms. The needle-like foliage, the scale-like foliage, which is very common in the group of gymnosperms. Think of your pine trees, your junipers, your cedars. That adaptation, that really thick cuticle, that waxy cover on the leaf, makes their foliage very tough, makes it drought tolerant. It can take a lot of sun, a lot of UV radiation, makes them cold tolerant. That's why you see them growing out in the mountains. A lot of times the needles and the scales shed ice, but at the same time, those needles and scales are very small and narrow, and they don't get a lot of sun. They actually are fairly small surface areas, so they don't produce a lot of excess transpiration. And of course, remember the resins in the wood help those plants also not use so much water. So there are a lot of California, even Southern California, and even our local desert area has many species of gymnosperms. So on campus, we have the main gymnosperm that grows wild on campus is ephedra californica, and it's a very interesting gymnosperm. It just has kind of like these bunch of green stems, and it grows as like a low desert bush out in our area. And not far from the campus, we have things like pinyon pines and ponderosa pines and Jeffrey pines and coulter pines and sugar pines. So all sort, and then there's other stuff. There's even more. So just beyond pine trees, there's fir trees and spruce. So California has a lot of gymnosperms, which is nice. Most of our gymnosperms, though, are descended from a cold weather, from the northern areas, ice age type stuff. So just like that, pine trees, fir trees, spruce trees, things like that. But there are lots of them in California, and they prove it very adaptable. Um, However, most of your, like I said, the tree gymnosperms in our area do prefer higher elevations outside of the ephedra. But, and again, there's exceptions. All over the world, there's different conifers growing all over the place. And remember, because those conifers, because of their physiology that's very tough and adaptable, and their tendency to make really close relationships with the fungi in the soil, these trees can grow in really poor soil. And sometimes they specialize in just growing where other trees can't grow. So many times you're in it doesn't matter what climate it is, tropical, desert, it could be a soil condition where normal trees can't grow. So there's no competition for that space. The pine trees are like, we can do this with our fungi friends, and they will populate that area and create forests predominantly of gymnosperms. See this a lot with pine trees and also like in junipers and things like that. So they are very cool trees, and they have a lot of botanical history, fossils, and things like that. Some of these trees, like your ginkgo on our list, ginkgo biloba, they haven't really changed since the fossils. We have fossils of them, and they pretty much look the same as they did millions of years ago. Very little change. So that means that they're doing something right. They don't have to rewrite the book, stuff like that. So even though they're primitive, they're still here and flourishing. So that means that they've pretty much won the race too, just like the flowering plants. Some people consider flower plants more evolved, which they are, but doesn't mean they're the pinnacle of evolution. It's just another way of doing things. And that's what you have to remember about plants. They're very plastic and they can change. Remember, they can't move, so they have to be able to adapt to their locations. They have to adapt to the soil, the edaphic factors. Remember the edaphic factors? Those are the soil conditions, pH, drainage, chemistry, slope. They have to adapt to climate. In California, lots of microclimates. You could be within just a few miles, can be a very different area, and that plasticity, the plants having to be able to adapt is really cool. And that's one reason how plants went from spore bearing to seeds to fruits. And there's even flowering plants that have evolved not even to use animals anymore. So, like grasses, bamboo, right? Your lawn grass, most of your grasses are flowering plants, but they're like, we don't need pollinators. We're going to use winds. So, kind of like the old gymnosperms, which most of them are wind pollinated. So, it's kind of interesting. So, even though, again, multiple ways of doing things. So, if you're in for Plant ID, one thing you want to remember about pine trees and gymnosperms, most of our gymnosperms growing in the high desert are pine trees. There's a lot of junipers as well. And there's also the deodar cedrus, the true cedrus, and some others. Is they, for planting time, the planting time would be in the fall. So I would do October all the way into December. So the gymnosperms that grow best in our area um, are going to be hardy to about 10 degrees, 20 degrees. The tropical ones don't do good in the high desert at all. Ginkgo does, and it's very cold tolerant. But things like Arcaria and some of the like cycads, there's one cycad that does well in the high desert, Cycas revoluta, but a lot of those other tropical conifers don't do so well. But all of them that do grow well in the desert are hardy to cold and heat tolerant, but they like to be planted in the fall. Don't plant your gymnosperms in the spring. It makes a little bit too much stress on them. Gymnosperms also are famous for being grown in pots for like bonsai. Remember, if you're doing bonsai, though, you have to research, and it's a specific growing condition and growing media and pruning, so it's pretty intensive. So you need to do that research, but they're very fun to do. A lot of the gymnosperms are very, again, because of their root systems and that fungal relationship, they're not as nutrient heavy as other plants. You don't want to fertilize them a lot. In fact, it's very easy to kill most gymnosperms with too much fertilizer. So I would use organic fertilizers, and then also a little bit on the lower side. You don't want to overdo it. Remember, they have very efficient roots, and they have, especially in the ground, will have probably a mycorrhizal association to help them out even further. Um, in the high desert, I love seeing the pine trees and the cedar trees because it's windy up there, and you get these nice wind-blown characteristics. Where a lot of hardwood trees and deciduous trees don't really do that; they kind of maintain their shape. But the conifers, most of them are evergreen. This is another reason why they're tough is they're producing food all the time. There are deciduous evergreens that lose their leaves, but the vast majority are evergreens. They're constantly growing, and because of that, they have a beautiful windswept look. We have, if you're in horticulture class, so that's 123, AGNR 123. We want to focus on that. The propagation of gymnosperms is a little bit different. You can do cuttings of gymnosperms. You can also graft gymnosperms. However, um, a lot of them tend to be easier to propagate by seeds. But that's not an exclusivity, it's just a tendency. But you can propagate gymnosperms. Tissue culture, I have not, I've known that they do some tissue culture, but again, um, unlike the angiosperms of flowering plants, there are some limitations. Also, if you're going to do cuttings of these trees and plants, gymnosperms, it tends to be a semi-hardwood cutting or a hardwood cutting. Softwood, I've not had luck with them in my doing junipers and things like that. Also, remember, not too much fertilizer. So you're going to be minimal fertilizer, low nitrogen fertilizer. So something that's has more potassium, phosphorus, and also I recommend like an organic fertilizer, like a compost tea, worm tea mix, maybe some kelp in there, but not that often. And also, you might want to dilute it to have strength when you do it, because again, these trees don't need a ton of fertilizer, especially in the ground. They're used to bad soils. And again, in terms of watering, it can be anywhere from literally growing in water, think of bald cypress in swamps of south, to a tree growing in barren rocks in Utah and arches. So the watering, you're just going to have to research. Um, Typically, again, in our area in the high desert, most of the uh, gymnosperms you're going to encounter are evergreen shrubs or trees. A lot of gymnosperms, think pine trees and cedar trees and Arizona cypresses and junipers, are very popular windbreaks because of that evergreen, dense scale foliage that just is very tight. And the wind can't really penetrate that very well. It makes great windbreaks. And again, many are drought tolerant, fairly tough. Some other things to think about. I've seen a lot of dead and dying trees lately, especially gymnosperms, especially pine trees and cedars and cypresses all over the place because of either most likely dry conditions, not enough water, and also excessive heat. That stress makes those trees vulnerable to insect damage. In particular, borers. There are pine beetles that bore into trees, and they can find and zoom in on a sick tree that's weak, and they will attack it, and it will die. The problem with that is by the time usually you see the dying branches and the sap and stuff, it's mostly too late. So if you have big pine trees in the high desert, I recommend, and I think it's worth the investment, to have those trees inspected by a certified arborist, tree health specialist, uh, not every year, but maybe every 4 or 5 years, just to make sure they're okay. And you want to inspect your own tree to make sure it's not being infested by beetles. You don't see a bunch of sap running out of the trunk or holes or dying branches. Because usually, again, if you see that, it's probably too late. To keep your trees, the only thing you can really do to prevent it is to keep your trees happy. Keep them watered, deep watering, not a bunch of shallow watering. Not like, for example, where you're watering 3 times a day for 5 minutes. You want a deep watering. Um, want that water down deep to get those roots down. Almost all gymnosperms have extensive deep root systems. It might not be super deep, but they're fairly extensive, and they're really good at efficient at moving moisture. Um, Having said that, gymnosperms generally are not really good transplant. So like if you can't, it's hard to like dig up a gymnosperm moving in. Some of our angiosperm plants are easier. Some are very difficult too. But in my experience, gymnosperms, unless you have a really big root ball, aren't easy to move. What else can I say about gymnosperms? I love our cone-bearing plants. I especially love the cycads. So you'll watch our older videos in class of the cycads, the one I just made of the big cone-bearing plants. They just look tropical, like pine trees or something. Because when most people say conifer, you're thinking Christmassy, mountainy, cold, snow, pine trees. So it's nice to think about that. There's also so many really interesting gymnosperm trees that grow in the southern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere versus the northern hemisphere has kind of very different gymnosperm species. The southern has, especially with trees, the southern hemisphere has interesting things like araucarias. You can look that up. Araucaria is just monkey puzzle tree. Just look up monkey puzzle tree. Bunya bunya from Australia. All sorts of really interesting, really ancient trees that in the southern hemisphere that are some of like the least changed trees you will find. And the northern hemisphere has a predominantly different mixture, more of your pine trees, cedars, cypresses, junipers, all those things, which kind of evolved later, but you typically find them in the northern hemisphere. And that's just because of glaciation and geology and the way the continents moved around after, as they split and stuff. But it is interesting. You don't really see a lot of, I don't know very many, there's probably very few species of like pine tree that are native south of the border, or cypress tree. There might be a few that I don't know, but for the southern hemisphere species are very different than the northern hemisphere species of gymnosperms. All right, so I think that does it for gymnosperms. I want you to think about, if you're in Plant ID, as you drive around town, look at your Aleppo pines, your Pinus halepensis. They're all over the place. Same with your Pinus pinea, the Italian stone pine. Also, remember juniper, super common, Juniperus sabina, and Juniperus chinensis tortuosa, the really common one. Also, it's called a cypress, not really a cypress, but the Arizona cypress, Cupressus arizonica, and then the deodar cedar, Cedrus deodora. Those are the main ones that I know on campus. And in horticulture class, just remember, think about the pollination and that evolutionary strategy. How interesting it was to still have these primitive plants that have a really interesting system of doing it that's different from what we consider or what we know that most plants do. All right. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in class.